Hello everyone, thank you for attending this presentation. So this talk is not just a talk about finance, but also how we understand the financial system once we take seriously the claim that humanity is part of nature. So here I'll take the view that finance is like an externalized organ at the service of the collective body of humanity. So there we go. So very often you hear this statement, like we are part of nature, but it's used in a kind of humbling way, like to stop thinking of ourselves as somehow above nature, as the masters of nature, as exemplified by the popular image of ego versus echo, like this humans among other beings, not man above everything else. But that's as far as the reflection kind of goes. So this talk pushes this idea further. Finance, AI.
By the way, did you turn the recording on?
Yeah, I did. Don't worry. So. Yeah. So finance, AI, institutions are all kind of human creations and therefore part of nature through us. So what happens if we apply that kind of analytical framework to the systems we created? So from an organological perspective, finance can be understood as kind of a social organ that assists in distributing resources, sending signals, and coordinating human action. But how do you go from biological organs and ecosystems to technology, institutions, and infrastructure? And the whole premise of this presentation is that our own collective development and the various social and technical systems we created may be unconsciously inspired from the biological systems that we carry within, as well as the relationships we entertain with other biological beings without. So we often treat our ideas and concepts as being kind of abstract or artificial creations of our minds, which can somehow sit outside of nature. But what if we have always been influenced in our thinking by the biological wisdom and the experiences that we carry within? So that's the lens through which I wish to analyze the financial system. Now, there are many thinkers and philosophers who inspire themselves from nature. They don't necessarily make the connection with economics and finance, but this is one of the concrete sort of application of that kind of philosophy. So, Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, famously stated that nature is the source of all true knowledge. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'll leverage the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler and his concept of general organology, which is inspired from the works of Gilbert Simondon, another French philosopher. And his idea is that on top of physiological organs, like organs in the body, humanity has at least two other types of organs, such as social organs, which include laws, institutions, government, and language, and then technical or artificial organs, such as physical infrastructure, the internet, artificial intelligence, and various other technological systems. The point of general organology is to understand how humans co-develop alongside social and technical organs and adopt a similar organological lens to ask whether systems such as finance, AI, blockchain, or whatever help coordinate the social body or whether they distort, overgrow, or destabilize it. These externalized organs undergo their own development. And so in the image that I put here, you can view the Leviathan, which was imagined by the political thinker Thomas Hobbes in the 18th century, if I recall, which was a kind of entity composed of individuals who defer to it or give it form and power, and which is supposed to protect the collective from various threats. So this illustrates a certain developmental phase in humanity's social organs. The state, the market, the financial system, digital platforms, AI, blockchain, can all be understood as such organs, each developing historically, each transforming the relation between individuals and the larger social body, and each reaching a certain developmental limit, requiring further evolution and transformation. So the idea of the Leviathan reflected the developmental phase of like monarchy of divine right, which eventually gave way to participatory forms of political organization like our current representative democracies. Now, nature has been solving developmental and distributed coordination problems for billions of years. So the aim is not to copy nature just naively, but to ask what living systems reveal about things like growth, maturity, resilience, and adequacy, and then apply it to human development, including the social and technological organs we created. Many living processes, such as plants, typically follow a kind of S-shaped growth pattern. So slow beginning, rapid acceleration, and then a slowing and stabilization as it reaches certain limits, like maturity in its development, when there is some kind of regulation or environmental constraints. Now, if this S-curve also applies to humanity and humanity's social and technical organs, this might help us reinterpret the challenges we're facing to identify the developmental phase we are in and therefore what we might expect in the future. Now you can see, for instance, our population, which is clearly a massive exponential curve in terms of the world population, and then the S-curve as humans may interpret it, which is, nothing is happening. So it's like, okay, it's still early. This thing is going nowhere. Okay, maybe it's not hopeless. And then as the curve sort of accelerates, we're all going to be rich. And then, oh no, what's going on? And then we're doomed, And that's just the human kind of feel for this more or less natural phenomenon that you find everywhere in nature. But as humans, we're not plants, right? Plants grow in the same environment from gestation to maturity. Now, our growth and development has at least two major phases. One, initial gestation, an exponential biological growth phase while we're inside the womb, where all our biological organs kind of develop and grow. And a second phase outside the womb where our biological growth continues but stops being exponential and is more about maturation of organs than the development of new ones. And on top of that biological maturation, there's a social and societal developmental phase where we learn to interact with our environment, our parents, our family members, other human beings, basically in society at large. So birth can be viewed as this kind of threshold between two developmental regimes. And it's a kind of a key event where the organism switches abruptly from one mode of functioning to another. Let's see here. So nevertheless, the same S-curve kind of appears in our own biological development. Incidentally, the S-curve is something many post-growth economists are calling for, a sort of leveling off of humanity's growth and development. So instead of viewing this as an externally imposed kind of throttling on what would otherwise be an infinite perpetual growth of humanity, one could view this as a very natural phenomenon, or the transition from one phase of growth to another phase with all the birth pains that come with it, if you will. Through such a lens, the various financial crises we're experiencing, the fragility of our economies and our financial system are not kind of random events, but natural symptoms of systems that have reached limits of the developmental logic for which they were designed. So a logic of continuous expansion, debt-fueled acceleration, permanent growth, and at a moment where humanity may be entering a new phase that requires stabilization, maturation, and adequacy rather than this kind of continuous growth. So if one considers finance as an organ, what kind of function does it perform? Now, Bernard Lietaer, who was a Belgian economist, kind of viewed finance as humanity's circulatory system. So much like blood, money moves resources through the social body like oxygen moves through the circulatory system. Brett Scott, who's a kind of monetary thinker, on the other hand, argues that finance is the nervous system. Much like the nervous system, money carries information on what collective human actions should be taken. So when you spend your money, at the baker, or when you spend your money and you give it to someone, you don't say, here's my money, do whatever you want with it, right? Typically, when you spend money, it comes with an ask or an action that you want to be performed. So wherever money concentrates, it enables to move humanity in a coordinated direction. When you give 10 euros to the baker for a pie, you're essentially signaling him or her to make more pie. So at a societal level, when money concentrated in the hands of the church and monarchs, that money was spent to signal humanity to build royal palaces and cathedrals. And today, when money concentrates in the hands of a few billionaires and hedge funds, it signals humanity to build data centers, AI, chips, weapons, pesticides, skyscrapers, and so on. So our current financial system was kind of a perfect fit for exponential growth. That's what it was designed for. And the way it works in very simple terms is that money is created via private banks every time they grant a loan. the monetary mass has to grow at the same pace as the total availability of goods and services to ensure economic stability, meaning that you should ideally have to have like the creation of goods and services have to grow at the same pace as the monetary mass. And there has to be growth to service interest on debt. And the whole system kind of relies on a rollover of credit into infinity. So old debts are repaid via new debts and so on. And this kind of exponential expansion mirrors the growth of a fetus while in the womb. It's like this logic shifts completely, as we have seen, once that developmental phase is complete and an organism reaches its maturation phase. But, post-growth, degrowth, or these ideas of sufficiency that you hear in this kind of milieu, is that really the answer? So to me, adequacy is a more precise and more biomimetic kind of concept. The right resources in the right place at the right time. So for instance, when you run, resources flow naturally to your legs. When you think, resources flow naturally to your brain. And when you digest, resources flow naturally to your stomach and gut. So in other words, the resources are distributed in your body according to the actual needs, what the body is doing, what it needs. So it's not about kind of this two polarities, of either equality and sameness, where everyone's having the same house, the same car, and a kind of Soviet communism, nor is it about these huge inequalities that we're seeing, where some have all the resources while others have nothing under, what some would call crony or extractive or late stage capitalism, as you hear these terms in the left. It's about a kind of dynamic adequacy which fluctuates all the time. So one simple example is your breath. Like try breathing very energetically while sitting down and doing nothing. That's called hyperventilation. And the symptoms associated with it, like dizziness, are directly related to a mismatch between the resources in your body and the needs. Now try to do the opposite. Try running while holding your breath. And you'll nearly pass out if you try. And so it's the same principle. And so in economics, you could say that hyperventilation is akin to hyperinflation, where you flood the economy with money while there is no actual needs and goods and services available. And holding your breath while running is like an economic depression, where there are real needs, but no money for goods and services to be produced and circulate through the economy. Now, degrowth or post-growth can be viewed as a kind of artificial or inorganic attempt at freezing or controlling something that is organic in nature, which is humanity, and by extension, the economy and finance. So what is the way out? What kind of systems could replace our debt-based monetary system? And here enter the relative theory of money. So that theory was introduced by French economist Stéphane Laborde in 2009. And the relative theory of money considers money like a form of voting. It's like a voting mechanism. So whenever you pay for something, you're essentially voting for the endured existence of that good or services in the economy. And the fundamental principle at the heart of the relative theory of money is to consider that each individual has an equal right to determine what has value and what doesn't equally across time. So it's the same as the principle of the wisdom of the crowd. It's a kind of like everybody, when they spend their money, they're voting on what is important, but no human detains this universal wisdom of saying, I know what should be important for everybody else, right? So when you go to the baker and you spend 10 euros on pie, again, it's the same as you're essentially voting for the endured existence of the pie. And so when money is distributed unequally, it's kind of like census suffrage in early democracies, where the rich had most of the weight in terms of voting, and the poor had almost none. Now, the relative theory of money seeks to create a kind of mechanism for redistributing money naturally, which can be viewed as inspired from natural processes like entropy and, what happens in your body, basically. Now, the RTM, or relative theory of money, grants every living being, including babies, a universal dividend, which represents an equal share of monetary creation issued on a daily basis. So in practice, you take the current growth of the monetary mass, which is about 5 to 10% per year in Europe, and divide that by the amount of the number of citizens, which is about 350 million Europeans. Then you divide it by the number of days in a year, and then that would be equivalent to about between 7 and 13 euros per citizen per day. And so the core question then is, in this kind of system, how do you actually achieve price stability? How do you manage inflation and deflation? Because in this system, it's not like a debt-based monetary system where money is created via debt and then is destroyed when the debt is repaid. So most economists want to know like how one manages the cycle of creation and destruction of money, which should mirror the creation and destruction of goods and services. If there's too much money in the economy, then there's inflation, and it creates many imbalances. Now, don't be scared. I'm going to go through this. It's very simple. So the relative theory of money's objective is to create a kind of stable relative frame of reference or a measuring stick to identify kind of core invariant around which other things can fluctuate. And that's based on the theory of relativity by Einstein, basically, which showed that, since reality is observer dependent, you need to have a kind of invariant that you find. And that one was the speed of light, which doesn't fluctuate depending on speed, right? That's what he found. In this case, in finance, it's really difficult to find an invariant because, money creation is always fluctuating, the prices are fluctuating, the spending is fluctuating, everything is always in flux, right? So there's no stable measuring stick or no obvious invariant. And so that's also one of the reasons that we're exposed to so much marketing, and so you have so many business models that are based on subscription rather than one-off spending, is because they're trying to smooth out the spending patterns into predictable and stable ones in order to stabilize the financial system by extension, because you need to have something like the whole debt-based monetary system relies on this kind of stability and predictability of spending patterns and growth. And so in other words, it's trying to adapt an organic behavior of humans to a rigid system which requires steady and predictable growth. And to solve this issue of invariance, the relative theory of money proposes using the universal dividend as a kind of a relative reference point. So instead of asking only how many euros someone has, we can ask what share of the monetary mass they hold. And that share can evolve over time. Now it's a completely different way of thinking. So here you have an economy where you have three people. And each one starts with a certain amount of money. Like on the left, you have absolute units of currency. On the right, you have relative units of currency. And so you see that you have P1, P2, P3. So that's the three people in the economy. Now, you see that they each start off with 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000 on the left column, and 5, 10, and 15 in the right column. Now, to obtain the 5, 10, and 15, you simply divide the amount that they have in absolute units with the value of the universal dividend, which is 200 in the first year. And you can see like in the left column, it's the last little column. So in those three columns, respectively, M is the total monetary mass in the economy. M divided by N is the amount of money in circulation per individual. And the last one is the value of the universal dividend. So if everyone receives the same universal dividend every day, then you can count in universal dividends instead of individual units of currency. So for instance, if a computer costs 1,000 units of currency, like 1,000 euros, you can also say it costs 5 universal dividends, which is 1,000 divided by 200. And so in order to make sense of the values on the right, where P1, P2, P3, you just divide the amount they have by the universal dividend. Now, the universal dividend is increased by 10%, say, in this example, per year, which is at the rate at which the monetary mass grows each year in our economies. And so you see that on year 2, the universal dividend is now 220, and everyone has received their universal dividend. Like P1 has 1,200, P2, 2,200, P3, 3,200. But when you look at how much money they have counting in universal dividends, you have an interesting phenomenon. P1 has 5.45, P2 has 10, so his actual share of the monetary mass stays exactly the same, and P3 has less than what he initially had. Because you divide the amount that they have, the absolute amount, like 3,200 for the richest person, by the value of the universal dividend, which is 220. And so what you see is like this very interesting phenomenon where if you look at the bottom, the very bottom column, after 20 years, if you look at the absolute amount of currency that they hold, obviously, it's the absolute distance between each of them is still 1,000. Like P2 has 1,000 more than P1, and P3 has 1,000 more than P2. But in relative terms, everybody's wealth is almost equalized. Like what that means is that they each control the same amount of percentage of the monetary mass. So if the monetary mass is 30, because it stays the same, in the left and the right column, they each hold nearly all of them 10, which means they each own a third of the monetary mass. And so it's easier to view it graphically. So the RTM, the effect of the RTM is that it sort of equalizes the control that people exert over the total monetary mass. And so each person is sort of pooled towards the mean. So you can view the RTM as a form of melting currency, but with a mathematically programmed debasement and with a very interesting property. So over time, everyone's relative wealth or share of the total monetary mass one controls is pulled towards the mean. And so that's the kind of invariant that you have. You know exactly what the universal dividend is. Everybody receives it across time, and its increase and the debasement is also kind of fixed. And then other things can fluctuate around that. Now again, let's go back to the initial premise of this presentation, taking inspiration from nature. So on the left, you have a graph which measures the level of oxygen in the body during exercise and rest. And as you can see, when you start exercising, the level of oxygen in your body during is multiplied by nearly a factor of 7 or 8. And then when you return to rest, the oxygen consumption sort of levels off and trickles back to normal. Now on the right, you have the same graph with 5 individuals in an economy, each controlling a certain portion of the monetary mass, but now you introduce exchanges. So for instance, here David gives money to Bob. That means that Bob now has more energy or more oxygen, you could say, to do something, like act in the economy, produce something. Just like, your muscles receive more oxygen when you're running. But if Bob stops contributing to the economy and thus stops receiving money from his peers, his level of control over the monetary mass gradually reverts back to the mean. So in other words, the RTM sort of replicates the same kind of mechanism as energy distribution in your bodies. It thus represents, in my view, the natural evolution of the financial system, and thus brings about financial inclusion more or less naturally. Under this system, you don't need to tax the rich and give to the poor because the system is designed in a way to redistribute wealth organically or mathematically in a way. So the million-dollar question, of course, is how you handle the transition from one system to another, right? And here, I believe the rollout of the digital euro is quite timely. It would be fairly easy for European states to open a digital euro account for every single citizen, including children and babies. Now, new digital euro account creation could be part of the standard paperwork when a child is born. And the central bank then credits every digital euro account tied to a single human with a daily universal dividend. But then, the whole question is, how do you transition out of a debt-based monetary system and monetary creation, and what role the banks would play in such a system? And here I'll, for the purpose of that transition, because we would basically be transitioning to a so-called full reserve banking, which requires rethinking credit and lending. So banks would no longer be able to create money via lending, but would lend pooled funds from citizens. Now, the inspiration for such a system comes from the Danish mortgage model, whereby banks serve as mere intermediaries between investors who are seeking a relatively risk-free yield for their money and borrowers who want to buy a home. Now, the Danish mortgage banks created what they call a covered bond, which pays a certain yield and is covered by the value of the house. And you can extend this architecture to all kinds of other bonds which banks would package, whether it would be credit or other kinds of bonds. Banks will no longer retain the profits from the interest paid on loan, but only a small percentage to cover risk and operating costs. Now, that's already how it functions, by the way, for the Danish mortgage model. So, in the case of the Danish mortgage model, though, money can thus circulate through society as pension funds are a heavy investor in these covered bonds. So instead of a kind of a trickle-up system where wealth concentrates in the hands of the wealthiest, such a system would enable more circular and socially distributed returns, where the interest paid by borrowers flows back to citizens, pension funds, and collective savings institutions, rather than being captured primarily by banks as creators of money. So these covered bonds would thus replace consumer credit, mortgage credit, and then governments would issue, their bonds as usual, which already work in a kind of similar fashion. And since citizens are the only ones that can generate money in the system, they're also the only ones that can invest in these bonds and thus contributing to co-shape what the economy looks like. Who gets a loan, transforming the economy into a kind of a real participatory democratic economic system. Now, obviously, loans would no longer be issued by banks, not only by banks, but you could have peer-to-peer lending and decentralized finance to start proposing these kinds of loans. Now, a really important point, though, is that the Danish mortgage model is incompatible with a debt-based monetary system since it relies on investing existing money in circulation, not creating new money through that product. So if, it only works when it's limited to Denmark, but if every single country were to issue that, then the amount of money created would completely collapse because all the mortgages now would only be pooled money from existing monetary mass and not the creation of new money. And that's why, this model could only be extended once you transition to a kind of a full reserve system. So I've created here a graph kind of simulating the shift from the current debt-based monetary system to one powered by the relative theory of money. Now, the blue line represents the debt-based money in circulation starting at the current level of M3 monetary mass in the Eurozone, which stands at about 17 trillion euros. And I've made it shrink by about 5% per year, which means that banks would issue 5% less loans based on debt money each year, and would issue 5% more loans or new loans in as covered bonds or as bonds, basically. So that line decreases steadily as old loans are repaid, and thus the money, that kind of money, the debt money, kind of disappears from the economy. Now, the orange line represents money issued as a universal dividend to each human being living in the Eurozone with a growth of about 5% per year in this simulation. The green line represents the total monetary mass, which adds up the blue and orange lines together. And finally, the dotted blue line represents the share of credit and loans that rely on covered bonds rather than debt money. So banks would stop issuing debt money after about 30 years, with the last loans having a maturity of like 15 years max, meaning the blue line sort of goes to zero after 45 years. And after 50 years, there's no debt money left in the economy. And now remember, obviously, this graph represents individual units of currency, not measuring the monetary mass in universal dividends, which is why if you were using the universal dividend as a reference, the total monetary mass kind of stabilizes. It doesn't grow in this instance because you continuously divide the monetary mass by the new value of the universal dividend, which is increased by 5 or 10% per year. And so now the green line sort of goes flat, not zero, mind you, but simply that it stops growing in relative terms. Now, as far as prices go, just as any country that has shifted to the euro had a transitional period where prices were displayed in the old currency and the new one, in this case, prices would be displayed in both absolute terms and universal dividends. And this new currency could be called something like a universal euro dividend or something. Now, remember how the system works. You're no longer counting in absolute terms. You're counting in relative terms. So that means that if you're counting, it's almost like you're counting in percentages of the total monetary mass. So imagine you control 1% of the total money in circulation, and the price of a car is 0.001% of the total monetary mass, right? So that's the kind of new logic you need to think about. The total amount of money in circulation is not that important. What's important is how it's distributed. And how much money is, how much supply is held by various stakeholders. So businesses, in this instance, for instance, you have the cost of bread each year would go up from €3.40 to €3.57 in absolute terms, but in relative terms, it would still be 0.4. That would not change. So really, like thinking in relative terms, the prices stay the same. It's just that the total monetary mass, the way that it's redistributed, shifts in the economy. And so what it means in concrete terms is that for the real poor people, bread is cheaper. For people that are kind of in the mean, in terms of the share of the monetary mass they control, the prices stay the same. And for the richest, bread actually increases in its price because they need to pay more absolute units of currency for the bread. So if the aim is to move from growth to adequacy, then the economy must also become better at tolerating fluctuations without breaking. Now, in a living body, resources are not distributed in a kind of a rigid, fixed way, like breathing accelerates when you run and the heart pumps faster under effort. Blood flow is redirected towards the organs and muscles that need it most. And so the organism does not collapse because demand fluctuates. It adapts to the fluctuation. Now, if you contrast that with our economic system, it's full of fixed obligations and fixed wages, fixed rents, fixed debt repayments, and all kinds of other fixed burdens. So a more organological system would therefore allow certain economic flows to expand and contract according to real conditions. Now, here, for instance, I give the example of dynamic salaries, which would apply this principle to employment. So instead of having like this system where employees receive a fixed salary disconnected from the actual state of the company, a large part of the remuneration would be linked automatically to the company's net gains, revenue, and value added. So, you could have a smart contract that distributes an agreed percentage of the company's income between workers, investors, reinvestment, and reserves. And when the company performs well, salaries rise. When revenues fall, salaries decrease within predefined limits. That same principle can be applied to things like rent, mortgages, business loans, and all kinds of other things, which can fluctuate within a 20 to 25 tolerance. Like they could increase by 20 or 25% or decrease by 20 or 25%. And that would prevent like things when income contracts, fixed payments remain, and defaults, when you have these fixed things, but you have diminishing economic growth or something, then you have defaults multiplying, businesses that fail, households that get evicted, and the whole system sort of becomes fragile because it requires bailout and governments to step in and increasing their public debts, as we've seen during the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID. So in biological terms, this is like an organ demanding the same amount of energy from the body, regardless of whether the body is resting or running. Which incidentally might be the case when the organ is developing, which requires a steady kind of input of energy. But then when that, you reach another kind of developmental phase, then it's a different kind of logic. So it's not about abolishing contracts. It's about including in our, vision of how you organize society, this kind of organic fluctuation in it. So a mature kind of financial system would not rely on a single currency to perform every function. So in nature, you see resilience comes from diversity. Bernard Littars himself was working on complementary currencies, and he was suggesting that the system we have is kind of akin to monetary monoculture, which may be fragile in the same way as an ecological monoculture. Now, in this regard, you could view crypto assets to be understood as kind of complementary currencies serving specific purposes. Now, some may serve, local currencies, some may be for sectoral coordination, some for, decentralized finance, some for governance, and some to pay for, specific decentralized services like decentralized cloud or decentralized computing power. Now, to give a biomimetic parallel to that transition from fiat money to a diverse ecology of currencies, again, it's useful to look at the micro patterns in our own development. So long as the baby's inside the womb, it depends on a centralized source of energy, so the flow of blood from the placenta. Once outside the womb, the organism now has access to more and more diversified sources of energy, like breathing with its own lungs and eating more and more diversified foods, which provide various nutritional benefits. You could view the relative theory of money as the equivalent of oxygen in this case, which is the universal kind of baseline energy, and other crypto assets serving specific purposes, just like food, like with various minerals, vitamins, and proteins that are needed in the body. And just like not every cell in your body requires the exact same minerals, vitamins, and whatnot, not every human needs to have all access to every single crypto asset. Now, Bitcoin is an interesting one because it presents a kind of different organological role from this perspective. It's definitely not the best candidate for kind of everyday circulation, like buying a cup of coffee, especially when you have this kind of universal dividend in place that acts as this kind of baseline currency that people use. Bitcoin, from an organological perspective, is more like bodily fat. So it's kind of a reserve tissue. Now, the fat that you store is not used for the body to sustain itself. It only becomes crucial in moments of stress, scarcity, or kind of some key transitions. Now, interestingly, before birth, a baby accumulates fat in order to weather the transition from being nourished via the placenta to having to breathe with its own lungs. So similarly, Bitcoin may function as a kind of a reserve asset or shock absorber when trust in centralized institutions kind of collapses, and when payment systems become censored, or when international trade needs a politically neutral settlement layer. And this is kind of already happening if you look at countries where you have hyperinflation. The adoption of certain crypto assets like Bitcoin has skyrocketed, like in Lebanon or Venezuela. Now, obviously, this metaphor shouldn't be understood naively. At present, it's clear that Bitcoin is really energy intensive, inefficient, volatile, and highly unequally distributed. But those limitations don't necessarily make it useless. It just means that Bitcoin is still kind of maturing in its organological role. Now, to finish, I'd like to explore kind of the bigger picture, or how the concrete proposals that I've mentioned above, like the transition from one system to another and the organological way of finance of functioning, how that sort of ties into the developmental phases of our systems of governance, our political systems, to kind of understand the developmental phase we are in and to provide a kind of meaningful understanding of the current challenges we're facing. So again, I'll start from the premise that the developmental stages we have undergone as individual humans serve as kind of a template for macro-social and political developments. Now, I'll simplify these stages purposefully due to lack of time, but it could be definitely explored in a more granular way. So initially, at birth and during the very first months, the way a kind of a baby perceives his parents and his direct environment is that of kind of mysticism or perpetual wonder. Like, the parents are magical gods that can manipulate objects and make them appear and disappear, because like babies, there's been research on this, they don't have this concept of object permanence. Like when you hide an object behind your back, it's almost like it doesn't exist anymore, and then when you show it again, it reappears out of thin air, right? And so if you transpose that, like, everything is magical. Like, the cat is magical just as much as a toy. And at the level of societal development, this translates into like early tribal belief systems where everything was deemed magical. The forest, the clouds, the sun, spirits of nature everywhere. And the shaman was kind of the highest form of authority. Then the baby sort of grows up. So that's like the old kind of way of thinking. Then the baby who grows up, and now you're a 5-year-old child. And that relationship to the parents now changes. Now the kid understands that parents kind of hold all the power. It's not the toy and not the cat, maybe the cat arguably is also very powerful. But, parents, and just as in the micro sense, parents can sometimes be just, sometimes be perceived as arbitrary or abusive, when they say no to a child's tantrum. Now, at the level of society, that translates into monarchies of divine right, where power is now concentrated in the hands of the king and the pope, and there are no more spirits of nature out there. There's just this one God that concentrates all the power. And then, kings basically, so the power now concentrates in the hands of kings and the pope, both of which kind of speak in the name of God. Now, there's kings mostly entertain the same kind of relationship to their people, basically treating them like children that need to be ruled over in order to contain their immature emotional outbursts. And if you read Thomas Hobbes in his legitimation of the Leviathan, he would say that that's because otherwise, in a state of nature, life would be solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, and short. That's like what he says, basically. So it's the kind of relationship they entertain. And then, obviously, the kid evolves. Now you're in the shoes of a teenager, and again, the relationship changes. Now, a teenager cannot be commanded arbitrarily. Now, parents have to enter into negotiations and agree on common rules. Teenagers also love to criticize their parents. They're no longer perfect in their eyes. So it's Nietzsche's God is dead kind of moment, Teenagers also protest and ask for more rights, like coming home later in the evening and choosing their own clothing style. And finally, some teenagers also love to criticize. They don't love to take responsibility beyond what is managing their own bedrooms and things like that, parents would know that, like when your teenager is wasted at a party at 3 a.m. and they call you for help, right? And so that pattern translates at the societal level as representative democracy. Now governments cannot rule arbitrarily anymore. They have to negotiate the rules with citizens. Citizens, just like teenagers, love to criticize politicians. There's no longer this kind of admiration, of citizens for the king, for politicians. Now citizens also go on protests to ask for more rights, so social rights, labor, rights, and all that stuff. And also the same pattern, like while citizens love to criticize, they also don't like to take responsibility beyond tending to their own private property. So mowing their own lawns and things like that. So when there's a pothole in the road, citizens don't coordinate to fix it. They just complain and point fingers at, the politicians that, don't do their work and all that stuff. And now, finally, there always comes a time when the teenager becomes a young adult and leaves the parental nest. And this means, in effect, that they become self-governing individuals. They theoretically don't require mommy and daddy to tell them when to get up, what to eat, and when they should go to study or go to work. And this translates at the societal level as this transition to blockchain technology, decentralization, which represents the emergence of systems enabling self-governance, self-coordination without the need for centralized parents like daddy state or daddy CEO to tell you what to do. And now, obviously, when talking about young adults, the beginnings of autonomy aren't all that glorious. For anyone that has visited a shared dorm or apartment or gone to a party with young adults that received their very first pay, it's typically chaos, right? I mean, there's unwashed dishes, a huge piles of laundry, as well as reckless spending and getting wasted at parties as a kind of testing of their newly found freedom. And of course, young adults are quick to realize that there is no escaping responsibility and accountability, and that not living with their parents anymore isn't a free pass to do whatever they please. Now that same pattern sort of is found again in the world of crypto, where you can clearly see the unwashed dishes and accumulated laundry in the form of scams, fraud, or vaporware, which has actually these crypto assets with promises but that don't deliver real value. Or you have also this pattern of crypto millionaires who drive Lamborghinis around and then lose everything in a big crypto crash. So it's typical young adult early behavior. And you can see also this pattern of gradual taking responsibility. Like when the very first DAO was hacked on Ethereum and they lost all their money, they had to do a contentious hard fork to recover the funds. They didn't call the state for help and the governments. They didn't file for bankruptcy under bankruptcy laws. They just had to solve that problem themselves by patching up the code and reverting and just finding their own sort of fix. And obviously, for those crypto evangelists that think they're outside the law because now they're using decentralized technologies, they're quick to understand that there's no escaping responsibility. Like, Do Kwon, the founder of Terra Luna, which collapsed, or Sam Bankman-Fried, both of which are prosecuted and in prison. Now, I'll finish with, this is the end basically, another organological analogy. Gradually after birth, the body of a baby develops homeostatic mechanisms for regulating its bodily temperature, as well as plenty of other automated biological systems for maintaining the body in an optimal mode of functioning. Now, what could be an organological equivalent developed at the scale of humanity as homeostasis, the principle of homeostasis? So you may have guessed, but to me, it is this emergence of automated systems like AI. So AI represents a potential for automating many systems set up by humanity, ideally to create optimal conditions for humans as well as broader ecosystems to thrive. So it can monitor vast numbers of data coming from the Internet of Things sensors to create, to maintain a healthy ecosystems, as well as monitoring human design systems like the electric grid, the internet, roads, the financial system, and the transactions, and to ensure a kind of optimal functioning. Now, as regards finance, AI should serve to monitor not only the health of the financial system as a whole, but also at the individual level, helping people managing their budget more responsibly or making more financial sound decisions. And that's based on what I envision as open source AI that is very transparent, running on the person's device, not the services proposed by for-profit services, which may be inclined to use AI to manipulate people to make financial decisions that are in their own interest. So AI could represent organologically the kind of stabilizing automated foundation on top of which novel experiences are possible, in a very similar way as homeostatic mechanisms in the body, which are a stable biochemical foundation for novel experiences at the level of the human body. So, in conclusion, my main point is that we're not creating things outside of nature. Our collective development as humanity could be viewed through patterns that can be found in our own individual human development. And by understanding these patterns, it can change our kind of long-term perspective on how to deal with the challenges we face in relation to reforming the financial system or integrating key technologies like blockchain or AI. And the time scale of these patterns are in the order of several decades when applied to these macro systems. But you can see how the proposals I've made, like the transition out of the debt-based monetary system and a reform on various parts of the economy, kind of maps onto the patterns that I've identified. And so what my presentation kind of suggests also is that we don't really have a choice in the matter. The transition is kind of inevitable. Like Victor Hugo used to say, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And so here it's just like this idea that these patterns are there and we're going to experience them. It's going to come sooner or later, and we just have the choice of how we navigate that transition. And so I'm not trying to say that this is inevitable due to like resource depletion or climate change catastrophe, but rather simply because every single human has lived through similar transitions at the micro and meso level. So at the micro level, when you upon birth, your umbilical cord was cut and your entire organism had to transition from one developmental and resource management system to another. Now then at the meso level, when you cut your umbilical cord a second time as you left your parents' home and started to live independently as a young adult, which also required an adjustment in your behavior and resource management. And now at the macro level, it's about cutting the umbilical cord a third time at the societal level, gaining more autonomy and independence from centralized institutions. And so how we manage this transition, like if we experience it in an abrupt way, happening after a major failure or collapse of the existing system, that would result in many hardships. So imagine if your parents kicked you out from your parental home at 18 and said, you're old enough, now fend for yourself, right? Now, I prefer a smooth and gradual transition, which is what I've presented in the slides previously. So the scenario and recommendations I propose may be supported by numbers and math, but the most important message is to rekindle kind of this idea of meaning. Instead of viewing our development as accidental and random, I prefer to view it as inspired from patterns in nature. Now, to finish, I'd like to stress that I'm not proposing a kind of happy, clappy utopia where everyone has the same amount of wealth and where there are no more problems. What I'm trying to push for is the creation of resilient and self-sustaining financial systems which mimics resilience found in nature in order to expand the problems we can tackle. So as the saying goes, when you're healthy, you have 1,000 problems, and when you're ill, you only have one problem. And the same holds true today. Like when we spend most of our time solving the problems that stem from an inadequate financial system, that's like if you as an organism was spending all your energy in curing heart disease, declogging your clogged arteries and veins, and healing damaged nerves. So it's not a very interesting kind of experience. So that's not what life should be about. So hopefully in the future, we'll expand the range of problems we can tackle thanks to resilient systems inspired from nature, making life a bit more interesting in the process. Thank you very much for your attention and happy to take questions. And you can contact me via the website or my email in the slide. I'll stop sharing and we can have a little discussion.